I thought academic freedom mainly meant academic freedom. So a faculty member could teach whatever they wanted in the class. But in China, academic freedom has a different meaning in part. It means freedom from the State Education Commission. It means freedom to have a little more say about a university. And so faculty were very happy to have, quote, academic freedom. But academic freedom to us means that in a classroom, you can say whatever. And this idea gradually has permeated China also, I must say, in a good way. It's become very difficult in Chinese universities to have real academic freedom now.
Hi, I'm Jan Barris, the Vice President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm really delighted to have the chance to talk to a very dear friend for, I don't even want to say how many
Many,
years,
many years.
many years, still single-digit decades, but many years. But Mary is a friend that I can always count on for an interesting conversation because she's got her life experiences. They're so incredible. She's had so many fascinating jobs and titles over the last 50 years that I don't even know how to introduce her, what title to give her. So I'm just, for today's purposes, going to go with author because we're here today primarily to talk about her new book, China on My Mind, which I highly recommend for anyone. And I know the people who just by selection are watching this also have China on their mind, although probably not as exclusively or as focused as Mary has had. So you mentioned, Mary, that your book is a professional memoir, not a personal one. So I'm looking forward to the personal one because it's clear throughout your book there are snippets from your diary, starting when you were a child living in China and then throughout your years in Korea and Japan and all around the place that you've kept a diary all these years. I am really impressed by that and really jealous. I wish I had done that. And I'm sure it made writing this book easier. But I hope that now that you've done that, that now you'll write your personal memoir, because I'm looking forward to that as well. But let's start with this book. What made you want to write it?
Well, I was in Southeast Asia with the Asia Foundation people, and it was late at night. We were waiting for an airplane. It must have been 1 or 2 in the morning. And people started talking about their background. And it occurred to them that they knew nothing about me. They didn't realize that I came from a missionary background and that I grew up in Asia and that I was interested in China for many years. They thought I sprang full blown, in a sense. So I thought they kept saying, "You must write this. You have such an interesting history." And then when I left DKU, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to write my memoir. And as I wrote, I realized, gosh, I really have an interesting background. That was not so clear to me at the beginning. But as I wrote, it was more clear that my life, in a way, spans the same period as you. It spans the ups and downs in U.S.-China relations.
And so that's, you felt you needed a book to explain
Well,
to those.
actually, also, and it was in the middle of COVID. So I thought, what can I do? And my husband, George, read and he listened to parts of this once I got going, I decided, oh, wow, I might as well finish. So that's why I wrote this. Well, part of it was also realizing in a way that I had not realized the influence of my grandfather and the influence of my family over the many years. So that was very important to understand. And I have always, as you know, Jan, I have wrestled with the question of a missionary background. So that, in a sense, this book gave me a chance to think again about missionary background.
Well, I found that part of the book really interesting, and it's something that I've known about you all these years. And I think it was hard. I think people say missionary background, at least people in this field, we think about China.
Right,
But your family was involved as missionaries also in Korea, where you lived for a
right.
very long time, and also spent time in Japan. So I think it's really fascinating for anyone, even if they're not interested in modern day China or US-China relations, learning about that background and how strong it was in your family is really impressive. And I think says a lot about the kind of person you are today and the way you interact with people. So that's what I want to hear more about in the next book.
Okay, we'll
But
try.
keeping to this one and to the professional aspects, when people talk about the potential areas of cooperation between the United States and China, which very sadly, as you and I have gone through, both starting with the downs and then the ups, and perhaps now that not perhaps, but definitely now the downs again. One of the areas that is almost always mentioned. Climate change is mentioned first, but
Right?
then public health is an
Yeah,
area
yeah.
that people cling on to as something that may be able to help bring our two countries together in a thoughtful, reasonable manner. You have been very deeply involved in many aspects of public health care in China, and particularly with the Peking Union Medical College, which you say in your book that you have a special relationship, a special kinship with that institution. So, where did the passion for this focus on medicine and the idea of looking at the Rockefeller family and PUMC, where did that and your overall interest in public health in general, where did that come from? And can you talk a little bit about that and also about how it has helped shape your views on China?
Hmm. A good question. You know, early on, I looked into the history of PUMC. I was a graduate student. I had no particular interest in medicine at that moment. And the more I looked at the archives and the letters, I became fascinated by the early beginnings of American involvement in China and also the medical and scientific involvement. So, anyway, I think one of my passions is the longevity of this interest. So, in a sense, I finished my dissertation, but China was just opening up. And so, as you know, whenever I went to China, I carried with me the record of PUFC, and I tried to piece it together. And then eventually I interviewed many people who had been at PUMC, and then later on went to different functions over time, most recently a couple of years ago. So whenever
Can
I
I
go,
can I introduce you? I'm sorry. Can I
yes, please.
what's the word I want? You have to
Right.
take this part out and tell you. Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because some of our watchers may not know what PUMC is.
Oh, PUMC, it stands for Peking Union Medical College. And it was formed in a sense by the Rockefeller Foundation, totally funded by the Rockefeller Foundation from about 1912 until 1951. So it's very definitely an American institution. But if you go there today, it seems very Chinese because the original buildings, I love to look out from the Grand Hyatt and look down at the original buildings, which are called sometimes Qing palaces, because it was built like the Qing emperor's palace. And but around this today are green roofs, very modern uh, health facilities. So it has evolved over a century. And so to watch it grow has been for me fascinating. So I think I write in the book, I always stay near PUMC. And so over 50 years, I have seen this change over time. And in the process, I became very interested in the role of the Rockefeller family. So, in a sense, I didn't start with that. I started with Peking Union Medical College. But later on, I realized how interested the Rockefeller family itself was in PUMC. And this is in part because of Wendy O'Neill. She was a great granddaughter of the Rockefeller magnate. And we went, and so I gradually, through her, especially through her, I came to know many of the Rockefeller people, including David Rockefeller. And so I write about going. Wendy said to me, "You must go to this garden in Maine." And so I did. This was a number of years ago. And David was still living, but very old. And he gave George and I a tour of the garden. And I realized this garden was based very much on Peking Union, I mean, on the Forbidden City. And that I went back and I read the letters between Abby Rockefeller and her, you might say, her garden expert. And she wanted to make this garden. I mean, garden doesn't depict a vast expanse, which includes walls that look like they're for Forbidden City. And so, anyway, every time I kept looking at the Rockefeller family, I saw that the family itself continued to and continues to see PUMC and Peking especially as their own playground in a sense.
But in a
So
good way, in a
in a
playground
good
they
way.
want to
That
nourish.
was a very good way. So anyway, that introduced me to, in a sense, to public health. So public health, I mean, Jan, as you know, I'm not a scientist. I am not a medical person. Well, I thought maybe I can understand public health. So this is many decades ago. So I started to follow public health, what was going on in China. And certainly there have been many books and efforts to understand what the Chinese government in different places was doing for public health, including during what we call World War II. So anyway, but the in more recent years, I think that the U.S.-China relationship has blossomed in a sense because public health depends a lot on statistics and also on monitoring what is going on. So if you can compare the statistics, you can get a sense of what is happening. However, public health is much more than just statistics. I learned, and you know, and the National Committee knows, it's made up of people. And sometimes the people get along well, want to share, and sometimes they don't. And so public health is very complex. And in China, I think it depends on the difference. between a national level and very local level. So public health in China at a local level is not as strong as it is in this country. So how to get along with China? China certainly emulated America and tried to have a national service, but it was not fully successful.
You say it wasn't fully successful, but yet in your book, there is a line that I liked that talked about the fact that even though the institution of PUMC was nationalized in 1951,
Yeah,
that the beliefs that motivated it and the outreach to the public, because it was a hospital that was for everyone and it trained generations and generations of the important medical staff in China, that is something that the two cultures were able to mesh with one another. And the result is a long-standing, over 100-year-old institution. And I know you went to the centennial anniversary of it. And as you say, it has now become totally a Chinese institution. But there are still people there who remember its roots and who I think recall the generosity, extraordinary generosity of the Rockefeller family. And it's appropriate that you talk about Rockefeller at the National Committee because it was through the generosity of John D. III, who just took about $300 out of his pocket and gave it to the National Committee as our first grant as a
I didn't know
startup
that.
for it.
That's
Yeah,
great.
it
That's
is.
great. You
Let
know,
me go ahead. Oh,
well, I do want to say there is a difference between medical science and public health. And so POMC was very good over the many years in promoting health through medical science. But public health is very different from medicine per se.
Right. That's an important point. Another theme that runs through your book is the liberal arts and the different ways in which they're viewed in the East and in the West, and how sometimes those don't always mesh. So I'd like to talk about sort of PUMC was the beginning of your career and something you focused on right from the start. Toward the end of your career, you became the vice chancellor at Duke Kunshan University, and I'm delighted to have had a very small
You
role
did?
in that. I called you to tell you about the fact that this job was open, and you said, "Oh, no, 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 I couldn't possibly do that."
Right,
And I
right.
said, "Yes, you could. You're perfect for it." And as your book documents, you are perfect for it. But I know that was an extremely challenging time. And but it was also a time that you finally got to create, as you say, to create a liberal arts university in China or help be part of its creation. And given your missionary background, in which education is an integral component, and your work at the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China, which was for a very long time a sister organization of the National Committee, and our two organizations were the only ones between 1972 and 79 that were handling exchanges between the two countries. And that's a really fascinating part of your life that I wish we had time to talk about here. We need to do another one of
We
these.
do. We do.
Because you also were a professor at Agnes Scott, and you were the president of Agnes Scott and a distinguished professor at Emory. So the liberal arts is really important to you. So can you talk a little bit about that creation of a liberal arts agenda or curriculum in China and how it brings out the differences between the thinking in the East and the West about some of these issues?
Well, I think that going to China helped to sharpen my view and understanding of the liberal arts and academic freedom. Because in Asia and in China, I think the liberal arts mean something different than they mean in America. And we take for granted the questioning that comes with the liberal arts. But in China, I think they saw first a move to include more subjects. It was mainly to broaden the scope of education. The role of questioning, the critical role that we associate, was not a part of China's liberal arts and never has been a part of China's liberal arts. And so when they say that when my Chinese friends say, I'm so happy we will bring a liberal arts to Fudan or Beda or some other place, they mean a broadening of the curriculum. They mean to that a student can choose what they want to do. They do not necessarily mean a critical perspective. And we kind of bring those together. That also has to do with academic freedom. I thought academic freedom mainly meant academic freedom. So a faculty member could teach whatever they wanted in the class. But in China, academic freedom has a different meaning in part. It means freedom from the State Education Commission. It means freedom to have a little more say about a university. And so faculty were very happy to have, quote, academic freedom. But academic freedom to us means that in a classroom, you can say whatever. And this idea gradually has permeated China also, I must say, in a good way. It's become very difficult in Chinese universities to have real academic freedom now. But I knew when I went to Dukunshan that there would be differences and that the American influence, you might say there was an American influence, but that the Chinese reality would be different. So that didn't bother me too much in the beginning. I think in 2012, there was an agreement between Chinese universities and American universities. It's called the Hefei Agreement, that that all the universities would strive for what we understand as liberal arts and academic freedom. I don't think you could have such an agreement today. And so I saw this when I first went to China. I had, you might say, greater hopes that academic freedom would roll over Chinese universities, but it's been slow in coming. I think we now have to recognize that the Chinese university, I'm not speaking of DKU, but the Chinese universities in general will be different from American universities. And we should try to understand those differences, even if we do not agree with all of them. DKU and Shanghai, Shanghai, what?
NYU Shanghai.
Yes, are maybe the only two universities that still cling to a more of an American concept of academic freedom and the liberal arts. And I do think um, they will continue because I think China is looking for, at the higher level, they are looking for examples of American influence. But I think this is seen very much as an American import. And actually, Jan, if you think back to the role of, say, Yenching University, or if you think of the Middle East, American influence has existed, but it not complete. And it shouldn't be. And we have to learn to work with that.
your where the question took you to leads into a sort of the final question I was going to ask you, because you and I, we have a lot of experiences, a lot of friends, a lot of questions in common. And one of those is exactly what you were just talking about. This sort of long-lasting, long-standing American desire to influence China. And I suppose, as you say, to influence every place, the Middle East and everywhere we get involved in, we think we should influence. But with China, it's been especially strong, and for those involved, very, very deep and very important. And so you've already talked about how we need to think about it in the education sphere, that we can't expect China to be just like us. And you've mentioned the two universities that are somewhat more, or who have accepted the
Right,
American influence to a
right,
certain
right,
extent. There's also Schwarzman, but that's not a university. That's a
right.
particular, the Schwarzman scholars are a section of another university. But I just wonder if you might muse a little more on this sort of desire of Americans, especially those involved with China, to influence it. And sort of the corollary to that, what about the influence that China has had on us? Is there anything that you think would be that you
Well,
can come up, because these days the word engagement is such a dirty word, and the mantra in Washington is that the Chinese only benefited from engagement. The United States didn't benefit at all. I think that is absolutely wrong, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How did the U.S. change as a result of our involvement with China, or vice versa, whichever way you want to talk
you know,
about it?
I laughed. I think first of food, because I do think Chinese food has influenced America.
Yeah.
And I do think that the emphasis on uh, community is stronger as a result of China's influence. I like the word influence because it doesn't necessarily is not the same as to change. Influence means we will have some impact. It will change over time. We don't know the full direction of this. But I think you're right, Chan, that if you go back to the 19th century, for example, you'll see Americans and others always wanted maybe to change China, or as I prefer to use the word, influence China. And that never goes away. And so uh, in the last chapter, which we're reading, I talk about all the boards I was on. I'm lucky to have been on those boards. But, I saw each of those organizations from Yale China, the China Medical Board, they changed also. They started out uh, very much apologetic for their role in China in the late 40s and early 50s. And they were willing to change. So, and also that reflects the changes in our own society. But then I think in one article I wrote, I emphasized strategic adaptation. So I think that these organizations, my own included, strategically tried to stay in China by adapting to Chinese regulations. That is good and that is bad. And right now, as you and I both know, American influence is not wanted. And I think it will be diminished, but I think it will always be there. And I think in the future, we will see the longer term. I think I don't know if I say enough in the book or not, but I do think that what we are involved with is a long-term influence, and that we have to be willing to take a long-term view.
You do indeed say that. There are a couple times where you
Good,
mentioned,
good, good.
especially also on your conversation, your last conversation with John Ye
Oh,
and
yes,
Daniel Hong, who are
right.
two wonderful women that you've worked with over the years.
Yes,
In the, I counted, you will have been involved with 6 boards, all of which have been either totally focused on, like 4 of them, like the Yale-China and the China Medical Board and the National Committee, from which we were very delighted to have you as part of our work and on our board for many years. Um, but in your discussion, sorry, I got off track there. In your discussion with these women, they evidence some optimism that this influence is still there, even if under the surface, and that in the long run, both China and the United States will be better for it.
yes, yes.
And I want to say that both the United States and China and the National Committee have been better for having your involvement with China, your
Thank you.
principled involvement, the integrity that you bring to everything that you do is really inspiring to all of your friends. And I hope the people who will go out and read your wonderful book with the great picture
Right.
of you on the cover.
That's from my first trip, my very first trip to China.
Okay, well, you look lovely in it, just as you
Thank you.
did today.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
very
us today,
much.
Mary. We're
Okay.
delighted to have you. And again, I want to read the second book. So
Okay.
I wait with you for a couple of years from now. We'll do this again on your
Okay.
personal memoir.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.